Thank you. Thank you very much. I didn't know who he was going to introduce. All those kind things that were being said.
Oops.
Point it away from the speaker. Point that speaker away.
How's that? No?
Nope.
It's on now? There you go. Okay, thanks, Vince. Thank you for inviting me here tonight. This is a remarkable turnout. Pinedale, it turns out to be a place where you can gather a large number of Democrats on it. Thanks for your good work. It's been fun the last couple of days seeing some old friends like Frank and Leslie Peterson. In 1982, Leslie and I were on the Democratic ticket along with Ed Hirschler and Lynn Simons. We had a great campaign, but for the voters, we'd have been great office holders. Good to see Courtney Skinner, a reminder of the old Tino days and what great friends that they were as well. I just briefly say, as some of you know, I've spent two of the last 3 years writing the story of one of Wyoming's great Democrats, Lester Hunt, who was a United States Senator, Governor of the state, Secretary of State, a legislator, served 22 years in public office. The last year of his life was made tragic by Republicans who were willing to do anything in order to regain control of the U.S. Senate, and as a result, Senator Hunt killed himself in June of 1954. It's been an honor to tell that story. Tonight afterward, we'll have some copies of the books available if you'd like one. I want to share the proceeds with the Wyoming Democratic Party, so it's a chance to learn about the history of this party as well as contribute a little money. Tonight, Ted Cruz is in Iowa, and I'm happy to be in Pinedale. Tonight we proud Democrats come together to honor the memory of two of the greatest American presidents. Both were unapologetic liberals, as should we be. Under Franklin Roosevelt, a man who was considered a traitor by his wealthy friends, Americans enjoyed decades of being a global economic power while labor unions prospered and brought democracy to the workplace. A strategy that included higher taxes on the wealthy that actually made them wealthier, while raising the standard of living for the middle class and providing a safety net for the poor. Under FDR, America took giant steps toward becoming the America that millions and millions of immigrants came searching for, a land of promise, economic equality, and social justice. And John Kennedy, whose challenge that we ask not what our country can do for us, but what responsibility we are willing to take for ourselves, contrasts so greatly with the selfish politics of today, when we have members of Congress who are willing to sacrifice the country on the altar of their extremist demands.
Yeah.
Not since the days of Herbert Hoover, when Republican greed and incompetence combined to turn the nation gleefully over to the Great Depression, have there been so many people holding public office with so little interest in the welfare of the country. Arthur Schlesinger wrote a 4-volume treatise on the history of American political parties, and of the Hoover years he wrote, "Sometimes parties mobilize to take office, but their relationship with actually governing is less obvious. From 1929 through 1932, the Republican Party found itself overmatched by economic problems and wholly unable to govern. It produced no workable programs to meet the challenge of the Depression, lost its hold on the national legislature, and upon public confidence." Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Whether it's the Republicans who control the U.S. House of Representatives or the Republicans who dominate the Wyoming legislature, their compulsion to regurgitate far-right dogmatic talking points so far exceeds their understanding of how government works and what people need as to cast a pall on the future of both this nation and our state. But even Stevie Wonder could have seen this coming. Beginning with Richard Nixon's so-called Southern strategy, you all remember the days when Nixon pitted whites against blacks in order for the Republicans to take Southern electoral votes away from Democrats, continuing through Ronald Reagan's demagoguery about how the government is the problem, not the solution, and the GOP's phony family values platforms used to manipulate conservative Christians on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage, the repeal of the fairness doctrine that once required TV and radio stations to give equal time to both sides of an argument, giving rise to the Limbaugh, Beck, O'Reilly, and Fox News era. The path on which they intentionally embarked, making the next election more important than the next generation, the Republican Party has created its own Frankenstein. It now haunts the nation, and even its creators have lost control. If you've read Mary Shelley's great classic, Frankenstein, you'll recall how the monster turns to its creator and says, "Hateful day when I received life, I exclaimed in agony, accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turn away in disgust?" But having its creator turn away in disgust did not tame the monster. It encouraged him to do even greater damage. "Beware," he said, "I am fearless and therefore powerful." And so today it is. Dr. Frankenstein has unleashed a monster on the American people. We are witnessing the arrogance of ignorance, a time unlike any other perhaps in our history when myth and lies become the currency of public policy, as entire television and radio networks dedicate themselves to an intentional redistribution of false information, and even knowledge itself is condemned. John Kennedy said, "Too often we enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." Half a century later, we find all too many Americans enjoying the comfort of opinions with the discomfort of neither thought nor facts. FDR said it a little differently. He said, "Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves." Gore Vidal said 50% of people don't read newspapers. He said, "I hope it's the same 50%. But it isn't. Some of us are old enough to remember a far different time, even in Wyoming. The last time a Democrat was elected to the U.S. Senate from Wyoming was 1970, 43 years ago, when Gale McGee was elected to his third term. Previous to that, during 80 years of statehood, 17 men served Wyoming, 17 Democrats, or rather 17 men served Wyoming in the Senate. More than a third of them were Democrats. And they proved to be among the most able, capable, honest, and effective public servants in the state's history. From John Kendrick to Joe Manning, Lester Hunt, Gale McGee, our party has a proud legacy of public service, one that we should know and teach others. These men were giants in Wyoming history and big-time players on the national stage. They distinguished themselves by putting their state and their nation ahead of their party. In those days, Wyoming voters themselves were intentional about electing members of Congress from both parties, knowing that a small state with only 3 members in Congress needed good people on both sides of the aisle. And it always worked well for Wyoming. Together, Gale McGee and Senator Hansen, and with Tino in the House, were able to do things of lasting importance for Wyoming. They worked together to increase Wyoming's share of federal mineral royalties, bringing billions of dollars into this state. They made certain that the rights of landowners were protected against mining companies. You think fracking is a big issue? Well, they actually stopped the planned detonation of a nuclear bomb under the Pinedale anticline, which some energy companies wanted to use to free natural gas.
Wagon wheel.
Project Wagon Wheel. They were a bipartisan team and they worked together effectively. The Wyoming Democrats also had more than their fair share of governors. 32 people have served as governor of Wyoming, 13 were Democrats. And from the time Ed Hirschler was first elected until Dave Friedenthal left office, Democrats controlled the governorship in all but 8 of those 36 years. And at the national level, there were giants like the Kennedy brothers, Mike Mansfield, Tip O'Neill, Frank Church, Bill Fulbright, Estes Kefauver, Birch Bayh, Hubert Humphrey, and to include some Republicans. There were people like Everett Dirksen and Margaret Chase Smith, Robert La Follette, and Robert Taft, and others. Today, it's hard for us to imagine, looking at this Republican Party, that when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, more than 80% of the Republicans in Congress voted for it, while it received the support of little more than 60% of the Democrats. I had occasion this week to see my old friend Al Simpson, and who has been a wonderful help to me in my book. But I said to Al, you know, Al, the great irony after all of these years is that I might be able to get my party's nomination for public office, but you sure as hell would never get yours. All these years later, we've really kind of lost track of what a traumatic event John Kennedy's election was in 1960. It was a traumatic event for millions of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans. Prior to 1960, anyone of any importance in politics, in education, in the business community, and elsewhere were Protestants. 1960 changed that, and when John Kennedy became president, we Protestants had to make a choice. Some of us chose to embrace diversity. Others chose to resist it. And all of that played out throughout our entire culture, not only in politics, but in the faith community, where it divided evangelicals from progressive denominations, in the business community, in organized labor, education, and even in professional and collegiate athletics. The choices people and organizations made in the wake of the election of the first Catholic president was whether to resist or embrace the diversity that was becoming more and more apparent in America. And it had its ultimate impact in the election of the nation's first non-white president. For decades, conservatives have been wringing their hands as they became more and more threatened by demographic changes in the United States. From the day Jackie Robinson walked onto Ebbets Field, through the days of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, to the early fights over affirmative action, the 1972 reforms in the Democratic Party, which opened the doors to full participation in this party by women and minorities, to Roe versus Wade, and the Equal Rights Amendment, the women's movement, and the growing acceptance of homosexuals, and the inevitable drive toward equality for the LGBT community, and the certainty of a future where whites became the minority. Those who chose to resist diversity have been increasingly led by their fears, their sense of loss, and the Republican Party has become their refuge. And the election of a black president was for them the last straw. They see those of us who believe in equality as determined to end their way of life as much today as did the slave owners of the Civil War era. And in the Civil War of these days, we are witnessing the death rattle of the anachronistic barriers to the reality of our times. It's why the Democratic Party matters now more than ever. Republicans may be on the wrong side of history, but they have a message that continues to allow them to win elections, at least in House districts. They understand the mechanics of elections, and they understood the mechanics of elections before we did. They came to understand that it doesn't take 100% of the voters in a congressional district to win an election. All it takes is one vote more than 50% of those who are registered. And what they learned is that those hot button issues that appeal to conservatives are the way to turn out votes and win House district elections. In their world, sending young people into unnecessary wars becomes supporting the troops. A right to life that begins at conception but ends at birth becomes family values. Cutting food stamps for the poor while themselves accepting farm subsidies and providing tax breaks for the wealthy becomes the means of managing the national debt. In their narrow universe, democracy is relegated to second place, behind their self-interest and allowing the richest people in America to buy not just elections, but candidates. And they call that free speech. Public assistance programs provide subsidies for corporations who refuse to pay livable wages, while those same people fight increases in the minimum wage, while claiming that low-income workers are leeches. And any effort to tax the wealthy at a fair rate or provide health care is called socialism. This kind of nonsense from Republicans is nothing new. In 1949, Senator Lester Hunt replied to a Laramie constituent who had written him a letter worried about how America was becoming socialist. Senator Hunt responded by listing the government programs that in his few years in the Senate he had heard Republicans on the Senate floor call socialism. They included women's suffrage, the income tax, the 8-hour workday, workers' compensation, minimum wage, child labor law, federal aid to highways and education. In fact, it seems to me, Senator Hunt said, every time we attempt to help the people, they call it socialism. Today, the Republicans have lied that even those who will benefit the most have been led to believe that there are death panels and special subsidies for Muslims. They've lied so long and so loudly that they have created a base of voters, that Frankenstein I talked about, who really believe what they've been told, to such an extent that even moderate Republicans had no choice but to go along with a strategy that threatened the future of this country until the very last moment. When I hear people like Ted Cruz say that Obamacare has resulted in workers losing hours as employers turn full-time employees into part-time to avoid providing health insurance, I don't blame Obamacare. Instead, I'm reminded of what John Kennedy said when the American steel companies demanded inflationary price increases in 1962. He said, "My father always told me that businessmen were sons of bitches, but I never believed it until now." That's an old theological term that we learned at seminary. And of course, all of these chickens have come home to roost in Wyoming. Since statehood, from the Great Chinese Massacre in Rock Springs to the Black 14 incident and the murder of Matthew Shepard, Wyoming has always had its flirtations with bigotry and injustice. As my friend Hank Phibbs pointed out in our conversation today, over those years there was a strong libertarian strain in Wyoming that always seemed to come to the rescue, that doesn't seem to be there today. In our best of times, we overcame those urges, but these are not the best of times. Indeed, these are the times when many Wyoming Republicans happily practice a form of human sacrifice. Governor Meade and legislators like Charlie Scott have sacrificed thousands of people in this state who need health care. placing partisan mythology above the needs of the people as they fight the opportunity to provide health care to uninsured people because of their unhealthy obsession with Obamacare. They call themselves fiscal conservatives while rejecting an opportunity to save Wyoming taxpayers tens of millions of dollars by expanding Medicaid because they want to make a political statement. Republican legislators who talk out of one side of their mouths about what the founding fathers intended blithely introduce bills to make felons of people who seek to enforce federal law. They introduce bills directly disregarding prior decisions of the Supreme Court. They use their huge legislative majority to take away the vacation pay earned by working people. Those legislators who receive millions in farm subsidies attempt to impose drug testing on the poor and the elderly before they receive public benefits. They enact laws reducing services to the developmentally disabled. While much of the rest of the nation is moving toward marriage equality, Wyoming legislators, Republican legislators, slander our GLBT friends with unfounded and ignorant claims. A black Republican legislator speaks disdainfully of the gay rights movement as saying that those gays are trying to co-opt our civil rights movement, as if only one group of Americans is entitled to civil rights. And Mark Baker, the young Republican who defeated our friend Joe Barbudo by, 150 votes, tosses his own lesbian sister under the bus so that he can stand up and make wildly untrue claims about the mortality rate among gays and lesbians. And they do it all openly with no regret or remorse. And they go home and run for re-election, in too many cases unopposed. It's Alice's Wonderland, where the turtle shouts, reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with. And then there are the different branches of arithmetic: ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. How did we get here? Well, in fairness, the condition of the Wyoming Democratic Party can be attributable to a couple of things beyond our control. The demise of the influence of organized labor and subdistricting. There was a time when labor union membership made all of the difference in Wyoming elections, particularly along the UP, where a big labor vote always delivered Laramie, Albany, Carbon, Sweetwater, and Uintah counties, and made Natrona County more than competitive. Their numbers, their influence in the community, their financial support and active involvement in politics always meant Democrats were competitive. Organized labor funded voter registration campaigns that kept our numbers within shooting range of the Republicans. Their members contributed countless hours and dollars to candidates at every level. But as their numbers diminished, so did the fortunes of the Democratic Party, which was no accident. It was a part of that long-range plan of those who supported right-to-work laws. But in my view, the worst thing to ever happen to Wyoming politics was the advent of single-member districts or subdistricting. I got to tell you, the idea that somebody who lives in East Cheyenne cannot adequately represent the interests of people who live in North Cheyenne is nonsense. And it becomes even more nonsensical when you move into rural counties. But the bottom line is that dividing the legislature into single-member districts has institutionalized a GOP majority, while making it more likely that Republican incumbents will routinely run unopposed. As every 10 years, the GOP majority in the legislature uses its power to redraw the lines, further constricting the ability of voters to elect Democrats to the legislature. So what do? Well, I want to offer 3 ideas. After Pete called and asked me to come tonight, I thought long and hard about what are the issues to which the Democratic Party can give voice that would make a difference. And I think the party should adopt the common theme that Pete talked about in his open with the slides, focusing like a laser on the issues that matter most to middle class and low income families: health care, education, and livable wages. Second, work for political reforms that serve the public interest rather than the special interests. And third, register to vote those thousands of Democrats who have given up on the system. The Democratic Party and its candidates must focus on a populist message, talking continuously about the same matters that middle class and low income families talk about around the kitchen table. 3 points. Number one, expand Medicaid. If you do so, the most conservative estimate is that the state taxpayers will save $47 million. And having served in the cabinet with Governor Freudenthal, I think that it's probably more like $100 million by the time Medicaid dollars replace all of the programs that we have created to help fund health care for people who are not insured. At the same time, the expansion of Medicare will bring millions of dollars into this state to improve the health care infrastructure, create jobs, and provide health care to those who do not have it. Second, focus on improving education, bringing parents and teachers together with coordinated school health programs that meet the basic needs of kids so that they can focus their minds on academic success and achievement. Perhaps we could even use some of that savings that Medicaid expansion would help with to make sure that middle-class kids and the children of low-income families get a college education competitive with those of wealthy families. I wonder how many people in Wyoming are aware that the Wyoming Constitution, Article 7, Section 16, reads, "The University of Wyoming shall be equally open to both sexes, irrespective of race or color, and in order that the instruction furnished may be as nearly free as possible, any amount in addition to the income from its grants of lands and other sources above mentioned shall be raised by taxation or otherwise under the provisions of the legislature." The founding fathers and mothers of this state knew how important an education would be to the people of Wyoming and put into the Constitution a provision that says education at the University of Wyoming should be as nearly free as possible. It isn't as nearly free as possible. Even the Hathaway scholarships have been eaten up by a continued increase in tuition and the cost of books. What if the Democratic Party were to take this issue on and file a lawsuit and ask a judge to rule what is meant by the provision that says that university education ought to be as free as possible? How much help would that be for middle class and low-income working families? Next. Next, the party has to continue its focus on increasing wages. Anyone who gives a fair day's work should walk away with a paycheck that allows him or her to pay for the necessities of life. The public benefits programs that Republicans complain about all the time, Medicaid and food stamps, are little more than subsidies to employers who will not pay a fair wage. You qualify for food stamps and Medicaid if you're disabled, if you're elderly, if you are a child, or if you are working at wages that are so low that you can't afford health care or putting food on the table. And so Wyoming working families, many of whom are working multiple jobs, earn so little that their wages are subsidized by the taxpayers through the programs that then Republicans have the gall to complain about. Democrats should demand the minimum wage be tied to the measure of livable wages in Wyoming, today about $14 an hour, and propose legislation to close the gap between what men are paid and women earn. Instead of paying fair wages, large Wyoming employers like McDonald's and Walmart instruct their employees on how to apply for food stamps and Medicaid. Listen to these numbers. Today, a minimum wage McDonald's employee earns about $7.25 an hour. The CEO at McDonald's is paid $8.75 million a year. If the wages of both of those people were doubled, the worker getting about $14.50 an hour, the CEO $17.5 million, the dollar menu would only have to become the $1.17 menu.
Thank you.
We really aren't talking about putting people out of business or destroying jobs, killing job growth. We're talking about the ability of millions of people, thousands in this state, to put food on the table and take care of their families by earning a livable wage. If we're going to be successful, the next thing we need to do is to recognize just how much the current political system in Wyoming is bent inevitably toward one-party control. Democrats should encourage political reform. You can alleviate the harm done by the court decision requiring single-member districts in two ways. One, if county lines mean anything in this state, every legislator should be elected to serve the county in which he or she lives, not some gerrymandered line drawing that moves lines here and there in order to pick off enough Republican votes to keep a Democrat from being elected. If we elected legislators from the county in which they live, it would make so much more sense in terms of who you represent. There are counties under the current system who have no legislative representation. There are others who have that line drawn in a way that means that a legislator who lives in one county has his or her business in that county, all of their social interests and professional interests are expected to represent the interests of people they know nothing about. That would mean adding a lot of seats to both chambers, which would mean that the door to political involvement would be open wider, and that would be a healthy thing for Wyoming. Second, take the responsibility for districting out of the hands of the partisans in the legislature and give it, as other states have, to a nonpartisan commission where both parties and qualified third parties and independents are represented and have responsibility for drawing lines that are not based on partisan interests. Third, put an end to partisan elections. How about instead of allowing candidates to hide behind a label, we remove party labels from the ballot to make it so that a person's qualifications would matter more than whether there is an R or a D behind their name. Somebody suggested that in the legislature on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion, instead of having electronic voting, we ought to turn out the lights and vote. And those bills would either not pass or pass, as we might hope them be. And the same, I think, is true about elections. Having that partisan ballot allows people to simply go in and vote for the party. How many good people in your counties have been elected or been defeated simply because they have a D behind their name, without any question whether they may have been best qualified? Finally, I want to say we're not going to win elections if we only continue to go after those who are now registered to vote, particularly those who are registered to vote Republican. The Democrats have lost that crowd. That train left the station. Those guys are busy out trying to out-conservative one another. They watch Fox News, they listen to Rush and Beck and O'Reilly, and most of them think Obama was born in Kenya and has a secret plan to hand the United States over to the Muslims. They think the Affordable Care is socialism, that food stamps feed the lazy, and that America should be a theocracy rather than a democracy. They want to roll back the clock on women's rights, voting rights, and workers' rights. If they were even willing to entertain a fleeting thought of voting for one of us, do you really think Cindy Hill would have ever gotten elected? In your counties and in your legislative districts, every one of you can cite examples of highly qualified candidates losing to people who lack a basic understanding of civics simply because one had a D behind their name and the other had an R. And it isn't simply a matter of messaging. We can hire the best, most expensive PR firm in America and not come up with a message that will move large numbers of Republicans to vote for our candidates. The only chance Wyoming Democrats have to get back into the game is to do what we do best. Regain our heritage by taking care of the forgotten, the uninsured, the poor, parents who rely on programs like Head Start and WIC, the unemployed and the underemployed, those who have been made indentured servants by student loan debt, the thousands of our neighbors who are food insecure, and the low-income working families working multiple jobs with no benefits. They are now, as they always were, our base, our people. But too many of them are not taking part in elections. They aren't registered to vote. They've given up on the political system. Just look at the numbers. According to the Wyoming Secretary of State's webpage, only 56% of all people in Wyoming eligible to vote are registered. That's awfully close to a majority. And it's the lowest it's been since 1978. Not coincidentally, the last year in which a Democrat, Tino Roncalio, served in Congress. There are more than 400,000 people of voting age in this state, and only about 220,000 of them are registered. 60% of the registered voters are Republicans. Our numbers are down to 21%. That's depressing. But the real question is not so much how many Democrats are registered to vote as how many Democrats are not registered to vote. And the demographics of the unregistered speak for themselves. Nationwide, of all unregistered voters, 30% earn less than $30,000 a year. 31% earn less than $20,000 a year. And according to the Pew Research Center, only 14% of those identifying themselves Republicans are not registered, while 20% of the Democrats and 27% of independents are not registered. Contrast the unregistered who identify themselves as conservatives or liberals. 17% of the unregistered are conservatives, 24% of the moderates, and 20% of liberals are unregistered. The overwhelming odds are that if we go out and register new voters, they will vote for our candidates. So I encourage you in every county to identify at least one legislative district where the demographics support the idea that there are a lot of unregistered Democrats and independents. Get the voter registration lists out, identify who is registered and who isn't, and go and knock on their doors. Establish a relationship with them, talk to them, get to know them, and get them registered. Think about it. How many new Democratic votes? How many new Democratic votes would it have taken to change the result in Joe Barbuta's race? And think about other races that we've lost. How many new registered Democrats in legislative districts in which you worked would it have taken to make a difference? Not that many. Voter registration is hard work. Working on messaging is easier, hand-wringing is even easier. But the Democratic Party matters. There was a time when our party went out and registered voters. As I said, with the financing and the help of organized labor, which has been diminished. But those were the days when we were competitive. Those were the days when we could elect a liberal like Tino Roncalio. Those were the days when Gail McGee could get elected, when races were competitive, when they were always close, when we could field good candidates who sometimes won and sometimes lost. But it was voter registration that always made the difference. It was a great honor to have been invited to speak tonight, and I hope my comments were helpful. The last time I was invited to speak to a Democratic gathering was 1982. I had to do a little soul searching on that one. I was a candidate for the U.S. Senate then. It was 6 years after Gail McGee was defeated by Malcolm Wallop. And not a person around the room that night in Rock Springs would have ever believed that McGee would be the last Democrat elected to the Senate from Wyoming for the next 43 years. We were hopeful in 1982. We had no idea that nearly 4 decades would come and go between tonight and the last time a Democrat served in Congress. But today, I believe there is every reason for hope and optimism. The people of Wyoming, the people of America, are simply too good-hearted to allow this to continue. Too good to be led forever by those whose political currency is fear and dishonesty, discrimination and marginalization. As the Gospel of Luke reports, Father Abraham told the rich man who had spent a lifetime abusing poor Lazarus, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things while Lazarus received bad things, but now he is comforted and you are in agony." In other words, the tables can and they do turn. My old mentor, Tino Roncalio, said it in a different way than Luke. Tino used to say that the sun doesn't shine on the same dog's ass all year long.
Yes,
He would say that.
Yes,
Martin Luther King promised that the arc of history is bent inevitably toward justice, and the painful days we are experiencing in today's politics will give way to the good and better angels of American people. I have a strong sense tonight that our drought is nearly over. That as Franklin Roosevelt convinced us during those dark days of 1932, happy days will soon be here again. And so I close tonight with the prayer that John Kennedy included in his 1961 inaugural address. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. Amen.
Thank you, Roger. I appreciate it. And there'll just be 3 real quick notes before we introduce you.